Welcome to I Love Apes. We are in Unit 2 of the course exam description for AP Environmental Science. That would be the unit on biodiversity. And today we're going to be studying the topics of endemism, adaptive radiation, and genetic bottlenecks. Let's get into it. So, a lot of these topics we're talking about here have one thing in common, and that's they mostly apply to fairly small populations. So let's see why that is. So small populations tend to be inherently less stable than larger populations, and this is mostly because they have less genetic biodiversity. So if I look at a small population, there's just so many alleles that I'm going to have for each particular trait, while in a larger population, there's going to be more of them. So what are some of the consequences of this? Well, if some ecological stressor comes along, a disease, a new predator, drought, what have you, in a large population, it's going to take out some members of the population, right? So we lost, these ones here, and we lost these ones here. Notice we lost the ones that had a combination that gave us magenta, blue, and I guess burnt orange, whatever that would be. But if you look over here, that's all we have. So if that same stressor happens over here, there's just nobody left. The population goes extinct. So having a small number of individuals tends to lead to low genetic biodiversity, tends to lead to less successful recovery from ecological stressors. So we'll start with that. Now, natural selection is something we covered in a previous screencast, and that's basically where nature favors certain genes, certain mutations, certain alleles over others. So if I look at this population here, let's just say that there was a color gene, right? So clearly there is some genetic selective pressure for the blue over the magenta. That's why it is more abundant in the population. Now what happens is sometimes, and the reason they have that is because this gene makes them more likely to survive than this gene does. That's why it's more prevalent in the population. All right, but what happens is we can have this thing called genetic drift. Now genetic drift is not based on goodness of fit. It's not based on how well your collection of alleles makes you likely to survive. It's just about chance. So let's just say we have this group of individuals and they're standing along a shoreline. And you know what happens? Oh no, it's a tsunami. And the tsunami washes ashore and it takes out the individuals that are closest to the shore and it drowns them, leaving these ones behind. Now notice what happened. This is called genetic drift because before the tsunami came ashore, the blue ones were quite more abundant than the magenta ones. But afterwards, the magenta is the most common allele, even though it's not the one that codes for the most success in terms of reproductive success. And so we call this genetic drift. And it's bad for the population because it can favor less robust genetic combinations. But it typically only happens in a meaningful way if the population tends to be very small. In a larger population, getting rid of even large numbers of individuals doesn't really change the overall distribution of genes in that population. But what about this? What if a catastrophe of some sort hits and it drops the population to very low numbers but doesn't cause it to go to extinction? What happens? So here I have my population. An event happens that drops us to a very, very low level, but we don't quite go extinct. And then what's going to happen is we're going to rebound. These individuals that survived are going to begin to reproduce, and before you know it, we're back to where we were. Our population came back because it didn't go extinct. However, the genetic diversity does not necessarily come back. So here's my genetic diversity in the population. If it drops down very close to zero, so I have a very limited number of individuals who survive, then I might lose some of that genetic biodiversity. And then what happens is once I've lost that genetic biodiversity, it does not rebound. It's going to stay where it is. And the reason is, whereas this just comes back when mother and father make a baby, you have more babies, and eventually the population comes back. Well, mother and father can't make new alleles. Only random mutations and natural selection can do that, and that takes a long time. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years. So this genetic diversity is not going to come back for a long time, and so this population, although it's back to its original size, is much more at risk should some other ecological stressor come along. we refer to this phenomena as a genetic bottleneck. So that what that really means is that we've lost a lot of our genetic biodiversity, and we're not going to get it back other than through the process of evolution and natural selection. Well, let's just say a mutation results in some beneficial allele, a new gene variant that's very lucky. So let's say we have a monkey species, and it's part of a large population, say in South America. So here's what we got. We have this. At first, we just have this one individual, through genetic mutation, ends up with this gene variant, this allele that's beneficial and makes it more likely to survive. Well, natural selection is going to favor it, and this is going to become more prevalent in the population over time. But watch what happens. This one individual ends up siring 5 children. So now I've got a total of 6 monkeys. And each of these sires another 5. So that gives me another 25. So I have a total of 31 monkeys. 31 monkeys all have this one particular allele that's very beneficial. But if I look at the population of this species in this vast continental area, turns out there's 10 million monkeys here. Probably a lot more, but we'll just go 10 million. So 31 out of 10 million, when you do the math, you come up with 0.00031% of the population. That's not exactly a very prevalent gene in the population. It will get there over time, but I think you can see it's going to take a long time because this gene only can become more abundant through reproduction. And when I'm trying to make it abundant in a very large population, it's going to take a lot of reproduction to get me there. But look what happens on a smaller island. So let's do the exact same thing. We're going to have the one monkey with the mutated allele that makes it more likely to survive, that natural selection is going to favor with positive selective pressure. That monkey lives on an island. Then instead of having 10 million monkeys, it lives on an island that only has 400 monkeys. Now the same thing is going to happen. That one monkey is going to give rise to 5 children, and those 5 children will each have 5 children. So that's a total of 31 monkeys. So if I take 31 monkeys out of 400 monkeys, what I find is that's 7.5% of the population. And that's a lot more than that 0.00031. What that tells me is something really important about islands and small populations in general. And that is evolution should happen faster when populations are small, because these beneficial genes that are being selected for can become highly prevalent in the population in a much shorter time frame. So islands are the crucibles of evolution. It's not to say it doesn't happen elsewhere. It just happens in high gear on islands where populations are small. So basically what we could say then is the rate of evolution is inversely for population size. The smaller the population, the more rapid evolution is going to occur, and the larger the population is, the less, because that new gene can only spread through reproduction, and the bigger the population is, the longer that's going to take. But when the small population, it's a lot easier to become prevalent in the population. Now, islands produce a lot of what are known as endemic species. So an endemic species is a species that is only found in one place. And by place, we can mean an island, a forest, a mountain, a continent. But let's just today think in terms of islands. It's a good way of wrapping our heads around this concept. So if you ever have the fortune to go to the Galapagos Islands, you're to be envied. It's an amazing place. I highly recommend you go. It's so cool. When you go to the Galapagos, the islands the animals are not afraid of you. You can walk right up to these marine iguanas and they won't budge. You just have to step over them. Sea lions, the same thing. Songbirds, it's just the coolest. Well, most of the organisms on these islands, they are endemic just to the Galapagos, like the marine iguana. Another endemic species, look how cute that is. It's a lemur. I've never been to Madagascar. I really want to go. Lemurs are only found in Madagascar. They evolved there on an island, and they are endemic to that island. And then look at this guy. Oh, the quokka. I'm going to go see the quokka this coming summer. I'm going to go to Rottnest Island. That's the one place you're going to find them on the off the west coast of Australia. You have this cute marsupial with that nice little smiley face. Now, these are endemic to the places, to Galapagos, to Madagascar, to Rottnest Island. Now, because islands tend to have limited resources, they can only support small populations. And as we said, if the population is small, then evolution is going to happen at a faster rate. So we find, therefore, is that islands tend to start out underpopulated. they promote rapid evolution because there is such a small population, and as a result, most of the world's endemic species are found on islands. And prior to humans altering islands, a lot of islands' populations were almost entirely endemic. But one thing we find that's unfortunate is that organisms that evolved in continental mainland areas, they tend to have a long time in which to evolve, and they have a lot of competition. So as a result, they're basically fine-tuned to being very good at filling a particular niche. And that's because there's been a lot of competition pressure on them to make them so. But endemic species, on the other hand, they evolved on an island that was essentially empty. Like, these niches were not filled. There wasn't competition to fill them. And as evolution altered these organisms to be better at these niches, there wasn't a lot of competition to make them extremely good at it. So we find is, yes, they are able to fill these niches, but they're not really good at outcompeting other organisms to do so. And unfortunately, what happens is when a mainland species gets introduced to an island, more likely than not, it's going to be better at filling those niches than the endemic species is. And the endemic species are often driven to extinction through the competitive exclusion principle as these other ones outcompete them. Now, humans, it turns out, have this unfortunate habit of bringing organisms with us when we go places. So when explorers travel the world, looking at islands, either by accident, say like rats were hiding in the bilges of their ships, they had cats on board to try to catch those things so that cats get onto land. Sometimes they bring goats and pigs and other high protein foodstuffs onto the island so that they can come back later and harvest them for food. So we tend to introduce these species to islands. Well, these islands are primarily endemic and they're not ready for it. So, for instance, when humans first arrived in the Hawaiian Islands about 1,000 years ago, pretty much every organism on those islands was endemic. Not quite, but to a large extent they were. But since that time, over 70% of the species has been driven extinct, mostly through competition with other species, but also through habitat destruction. But the point is that introducing these species to these islands, the endemics are just not equipped to compete, and they often go extinct. So you can also get endemic species that evolve in the core areas of very stable, long-lasting ecosystems, which, let's face it, it's mostly going to be tropical rainforests because they're close to the equator, where climate change doesn't often affect the climate there as much. And these endemics tend to fill very, very specific, narrow sub-niches because of all the competition there. So they often gain their evolutionary success by co-evolving with other species in a mutualistic fashion. So you get these symbiotic relationships that are bizarre and fascinating. So, for instance, you have like the Hoatzin. So the Hoatzin is this bird that's found in the Amazonian area. And what's different about it is that unlike other birds, it has done what cows essentially do, which it has a symbiotic relationship with a type of bacteria in its gut that allows it to eat leaves. Birds don't usually eat leaves. They eat fruits, they eat seeds, but they don't eat leaves. But this one, like a deer or a cow, can eat leaves because it has this symbiotic relationship. So there's this food resource, leaves. None of the other birds were accessing it, and over time, evolution found a solution to allow it to access that food resource. You have these poison arrow frogs. I'm sure you've seen pictures of them. They're so beautiful, but also so deadly. What's interesting is the poison in their skin, which gives them protection against predators, they don't manufacture it themselves. They get it by eating certain species of ants, and they have evolved a mechanism by which the poison in the ants gets moved into their skin and stored in glands in their skin to give them this poisonous aspect. Again, it gives them this advantage in their ecosystem by allowing them to avoid predation. And then we have lemon ants that live also in Amazonia. So these ants only live on this one particular tree, and this tree cannot live without these ants. So here's the deal. In a rainforest, in a tropical rainforest, if you're a plant, the main limiting factor is light. The light is available at the canopy, but if you're not in the canopy, you don't get light. Well, what these ants do is anything that grows near these trees, they kill any other plants to try to make sure that this tree gets access to light. And in return, what happens is this tree has evolved a hollow interior to its limbs that give the ants a place to live, so that they have this mutual relationship that they both depend on. So what we find is on islands, the endemic species tend to be not particularly narrow in their niches. And in well-established ecosystems like tropical rainforests, the endemic species tend to be these highly specialized ones that have evolved these symbiotic relationships over time. But let's go back to islands. So how is it exactly that islands get colonized in the first place? All right, in the natural world, without humans bringing things over. So here I have a continental mainland area, not very great, but that's the best I can do. Here's a river. Okay, I had to label it, otherwise you wouldn't know what it was. All right, here's an island, and here's the ocean. So this island, right now, let's just say it's completely uninhabited by mammals. Well, here's what happens. So you'll get a storm that happens here in the mainland, and it will cause flooding of these rivers. And a lot of debris will get washed down the rivers, and a lot of animals will get trapped in the floods, and they'll climb onto these branches and these logs, and they'll get carried out into the ocean. It's called rafting. So I have these animals now on this log. So I'll put a couple of animals there. Okay, here we go. So they could be plant seeds. They could be animals. Let's just say in this case it's maybe some lizards. Okay. Well, what's going to happen now is they have survived drowning by grabbing hold of this, but now they're in the ocean. They're exposed to the elements. There's no food for them to eat. There's no water to drink. There's a lot of sun exposure. But what happens is, now, if the ocean currents and winds are just right, they're going to move it away from the shore, so it ends up here. And over time, it gets further and further from the continental mainland until, by random chance, it washes up on the island. And these organisms can now jump onto the island and start living there. If there's food for them and there's water, they're going to start living. They're going to start reproducing. But there's all these unfilled niches, and so evolution is going to change them into new species. So over time, species from the mainland that came over as species A evolved into species B, which is endemic to this island. That's basically the principle by which this works. And we'll talk in a later episode about how the distance and size of the islands is going to affect this. Now, when these organisms arrive on the island, there are some food resources there, but maybe these food resources are not always that abundant, because maybe, let's say, the fruit is high up in the trees, or there's food, but it's in these water plants that are out in the water, and these organisms aren't really adapted to going out in the water to get it. Or maybe there's nuts that are just too hard for their jaws and their teeth to be able to open. So there's these unusable food resources. Well, you know what evolution is going to do? It's going to alter it over time. And so the descendants of these arrivals, these colonist species, will eventually begin to be altered by natural selection. And so what you'll end up having then over time is you'll have some of their descendants will evolve into these mammals that have these longer arms and claws that allow them to climb up to the tree to get the fruit that was up there. Or maybe some of them, their hands will become more paddle-like, and they'll be able to swim out into the water, maybe hold their breath an extra long time and access the food resources in these water plants. Or maybe some of them will evolve in such a way that they have much larger jaws and more powerful muscles and bigger teeth, so they can access the nuts that are hard to open. Now, this one colonist species, therefore, evolved in this example into 3 different species. So these 3 different species of endemic species on this island have the same common ancestor, who was the colonist. And when this happens, we refer to this as adaptive radiation. So adaptive radiation is basically the process by which evolution takes, basically, let's say, a colonist species, and over time alters it so that it can access other resources. So here I have this bird, and over time some of its descendants will be able to eat leaves like the Hoatzin. Other ones will eat insects. Other ones will evolve beaks to let them get at nectar and flowers. Other ones will will evolve to eat seeds, and other ones fruit. So this one ancestor gave rise to, in this case, 5 different species that each fill different niches. That is what we mean by adaptive radiation. And hey, adaptive radiation can do some impressive stuff. So 55 million years ago, Australia was dominated, it says nominated, it wasn't nominated, it was dominated, I'll fix that, by these egg-laying mammals called monotremes. And the only ones of them that are left are the echidna and the platypus. But they used to fill all the niches on this island. They're giant ones, they were whatever, but they were the kings of Australia. But then this land bridge formed with what's now South America. This is during the Gondwana Pangea time. And what happened is marsupials, mammals that have pouches, they ended up on this island. And it turns out that they are just better able to compete than the monotremes were, than the egg-laying ones. And why? Well, they had a better, more efficient reproductive strategy. Laying eggs is just not as efficient as giving birth to live young and giving them milk inside the pouch. Also, these organisms had higher metabolism, so they were better able to outcompete the other ones. But the thing to keep in mind, though, you're seeing all these organisms here, but the first one that arrived was basically like this. It was basically like a shrew, like a little bit more than a mouse. And over time, adaptive radiation altered it so that some of its descendants could fly. Some of them were vicious predators. Some of them could jump and bounce around. Other ones could dig really well. Other ones could climb trees and eat eucalyptus. The bottom line is from a small number of pioneer organisms, colonial organisms, adaptive radiation made them fill all these niches and evolve into a very wide variety of organisms. And I've got an even better example than that. 66 million years ago, you've probably heard, Earth had a very bad day because an asteroid hit it and just changed everything. So before the asteroid, most terrestrial vertebrates were dinosaurs, and they filled pretty much all the niches that were there. But after the impact, they went extinct. And so there was all these unfilled niches. And so what you had was this little tiny rat-like organism over time is like, whoa, all the dinosaurs are gone. And evolution slowly changed it to become all the different things. Now, just let this sink in. This mouse-like creature that burrowed under the ground, hiding from the dinosaurs, had this narrow little niche. Its descendants became bats, became monkeys, became rabbits, became tigers and lions, whales, for God's sake, right? It evolved into all these different things, elephants, but they all came from this one little initial ancestor. And that is the idea of adaptive radiation. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, please go ahead and like this video. If there's something I do to make this better, or if there's another video you'd like me to make, please drop me a comment. You should probably check the description below because I do sometimes post problems that could help you do better on your AP test. And of course, you know it's coming. Please hit that subscribe button for me.